This session is entitled Reflections, and it's also, obviously, from the comments you've already heard, addressing what we might do in the future. I think the good news, obviously, is that unlike Pirates of the Caribbean, the sequel was just as good as the first time, as Tarrytown 1, and we can assume that Tarrytown 3 will be also very exciting. In the opening session, David Winikoff argued for the democratic governance of science and technology, and I think some of us thinking what was going on in Washington, D.C. these days, worry about the so-called democratic governance of anything that isn't already under democratic governance. But what David was really asking, of course, was how can we make this form of governance of science and technology real? And, oh my goodness, do I have the beeper? Just, here it is. And he suggested these three things: that we open up closed spaces through critical analysis, that we actively and directly challenge both policies and practices, and that we move beyond reaction to create new means of action guided by values. I want to add 6 more C's to the list: cooperation and support among colleagues, concerted collaboration, an examination of causation, some caution and care, context, and communication. So I'll explore these, and in the spirit of what Susan was just saying, I think I'm going to problematize some of them somewhat. Now, as for cooperation, the easiest way to achieve it is if we have a common objective. And Eric suggested that we do. He said that the meeting is about getting on the same page regarding how does genetics impact our lives, in the environment, in the workplace, in law, in medicine. But is the future of genetic technology truly a common thread, or are our concerns broader than the use of genes to alter life? There certainly seems to be, the answer to that would be yes, as we saw last night in the artistic presentations. We also saw a challenge to cooperation when objections were raised very strongly to what was perceived as attacks on scientists. This is not the time or place to consider the argument that scientific activity is neutral, or whether outside observational studies it is possible in the life sciences to think of scientific research being totally independent of actions that affect life and therefore embody values. It is enough to note that no one, so far as I know, wanted to demonstrate to demonize scientists as individuals or attack their integrity. Rather, we wanted to recognize that most scientists are not independent actors, but rather workers in institutional and corporate environments, and as Dr. McLean reminded us, therefore at risk of injury from workplace dangers just like anyone else. So when we think of cooperation, we must treat scientists as colleagues, and to the extent that they are not represented fully in this room, we must reach out to them as people as allies with special knowledge and deep investment in seeing that their work produces something of which they can be proud. So what about concerted collaboration? How then do we take this action? How do we work together? Indeed, can we even be sure that we can and will be able to collaborate, especially since we all know from our own fields that it is easiest to mobilize people around identifiable, specific, discrete problems, not broad concepts. David argued that the project of articulating the Tarrytown values provides a means of building connections among groups operating in many different fields. I think there's a need for some caution here. Many years ago, Ed Lindblom argued rather persuasively for the science of muddling through. That is, that actions are not undertaken because of grand principles, or even that the people coming together on them necessarily agree in general, but rather they act because their individual values are served by that collective decision there, even if they don't agree on what other things are worthwhile or even why they're acting. I think that that's important because I don't think that the principles and values that we often see referred to in the document, such as that document that we were given, tell us very much about how to take concrete actions. Bioethics has been very much based, for example, on individualism. The Oviedo Convention says, interests in the welfare of human beings shall prevail over the sole interests of science and society. Now, that principle is born out of our sad experience of the abuse of human beings in science and medicine. But does this establish not only a radical form of autonomy, I get to choose whatever I want, but also a radical action on resource allocation? What about the lessons that we have learned from the environment about the dangers when individual actions neglect the common good? Or likewise in public health, where the welfare of the community may sometimes need to prevail over an individual's view of his or her personal interest in welfare, whether through vaccination, quarantine, confinement without consent, or the like. Does that trench on human dignity? Statements of rights and principles seldom provide the means of adjudicating among these principles. And just think, for example, of the principle of dignity as it affects human reproductive cloning. Does it allow that cloning because of the individual's vision of their common good, as the Center for American Progress says in its bioethics initiative, or does it condemn it because such a form of reproduction is inherently undignified and would violate what the EU calls the inviolable principle of human dignity? So I think this causes us then to turn to the causation. To get ahead of the problems, Colin O'Neill urged us to look at the causes whence the problems are coming from. And we've heard a lot about those which have corporate aspects. Someone invoked the image in our opening session of Rich Hayes someday presiding over a UN assembly of some sort, debating a new statement of principles, and I just thought that was a horrible image. Not because I wouldn't want Rich to have a dignified position like that, but because what a waste of time. As Eric pointed out to us, it is much more important to be concerned with the bilateral treaties being negotiated in trade by the United States with countries that do not have the technical or institutional strength to resist unreasonable provisions than it is to rejoice over a few indigenous people being invited to a WIPO meeting in Geneva. So I think that Michelle Goodwin was right to include in her list of cautions to us placing reliance on principles and values without asking whose principles and values, where do they come from? As the films last night showed us, we have to have caution and act with care because the lives and interests of real people are affected deeply. For example, it is often said that while therapy, whether it's genetic, pharmaceutical, or mechanical, is okay, enhancements are not. Yet as Fixed made clear last night, certain new technologies are not accepted by careful process, but simply put into use despite objections that they may have harm in the future. The new technologies bring new benefits, and with that the question of who will have access to them, but they also can transform us in ways that go beyond concerns about the justice of access to them, and ask whether there are any grounds on which we can resist the technological imperative. Now, in terms of context, I put this here because we often want to engage in generalization. That is, the statement of broad principles, because doing so can help us to achieve consistency across the cases, which in turn can lead to fairness, predictability, and simplicity. We can have bureaucrats making decisions according to predetermined choices rather than experts having to make very nuanced, difficult choices in every case. But ignoring context causes its own problems. Made in India illustrated the issue. Is the problem that the women got only $2,000 instead of the $7,000 the couple thought they were paying? Or is the problem that she was paid it all? Only by understanding the context can we know whether a choice represents an exercise of autonomy or a form of commodification. So that brings me to the last C of communication. Finding effective means of communicating to the public with a lot of other things on their minds is very difficult, as the session on how we can stay on message yesterday suggested to us. But I want to ask a different question in closing, which is, can we engage in a process of raising awareness and hearing back from the public what they are concerned about through the various grassroots organizations with which we connect, without yet having a single action campaign in which we want to enlist the public? In other words, as we work to understand whether we are fully united by common values and to create what Dorothy Roberts just urged us to, a more humane biotechnology, can we begin this process recognizing the problems that still affect our ability to come together and always to be on the same page? Thank you.